My son Miles was 8 years old the first time he grabbed my sleeve at the bus stop and whispered, "Dad, she's dangerous." He was pointing across the street at Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield, a 71-year-old widow who lived alone in the yellow house with the wraparound porch, the same woman who left oatmeal cookies on our doorstep every Sunday. I laughed it off that morning. 3 months later, I stood at her funeral in a borrowed black suit, and her lawyer walked up to me, holding a sealed envelope with my name written on it in careful, shaking cursive. He said, "She wanted you to have this before anyone else." I opened it, standing right there among the folding chairs and the lilies. And by the third line, my hands had gone numb, my throat had closed, and I could not move. I just stood there frozen, while people filed past me, offering condolences I couldn't hear. Before I tell you what was written on that page, I need to tell you how we got there, because none of it makes sense without the beginning. 2 years before that funeral, I was a wreck of a father barely holding a house together. My wife Carla died in a car accident on the 405 on a Tuesday night in March, hit by a driver who ran a red light while looking at his phone. Miles was 6. I was 34 and suddenly the only parent standing in a house full of her coffee mugs and her handwriting on the grocery list still stuck to the fridge. I worked as a project manager for a mid-sized construction firm in Ontario, California, the kind of job that let me leave the office by 5, but never let me leave the guilt behind. I moved us into a smaller house on Larkspur Street because the old one had too many rooms that used to be hers. That's where I met Eleanor Whitfield, though at the time I didn't think much of her beyond being the quiet old woman next door, with the wind chimes and the rose bushes trimmed into perfect little domes. She had a habit of watching the street from her porch swing with a mug of tea, rain or shine, and she always waved at Miles like he was the most important person to walk past her house that day. In the beginning, Miles waved back. He'd run up her walkway sometimes to pet her orange cat, Biscuit, and she'd let him, laughing at how the cat tolerated exactly 90 seconds of affection before swatting him away. I remember thinking, this is good. This is the kind of neighbor a broken family needs. Someone steady and kind who isn't trying to fix us, just exists nearby like a lighthouse. Then, around the 6-month mark of living there, something shifted in Miles. It was subtle at first. He stopped waving. He started walking on the far side of the sidewalk to avoid her yard, dragging his backpack against the fence posts like he was trying to put distance between himself and her porch. I noticed it but didn't push, because grief makes kids strange in ways you can't always explain, and I told myself it was just a phase, the way everything with him had been a phase since Carla died. The night terrors, the refusal to eat green food, the sudden fear of thunderstorms that hadn't existed before her death. It was a Thursday in October when he said it directly. We were at the bus stop, and Mrs. Whitfield had stepped out onto her porch in her cardigan to collect her newspaper. Miles grabbed my sleeve hard enough to leave a crease in my jacket and said, low enough that I had to lean down to hear him, "Dad, she's dangerous. You shouldn't let her look at me." I asked him what he meant. He wouldn't say more. He just shook his head and stared at his shoes until the bus came, and when I asked him again that evening over dinner, he changed the subject to a video game he wanted for his birthday. Kids do that. They plant something heavy in a 5-second sentence and then bury it before you can dig it out. I let it go that night, but it stuck in the back of my mind like a splinter I couldn't quite locate. A week later, I noticed something myself, something I couldn't easily explain away. I was taking the trash out around 9 at night and saw a light flick on in Eleanor's upstairs window, the one that faced our backyard. I saw a shape move behind the curtain, and for a moment it looked like she was holding something up to her eye, something small and cylindrical. I told myself it was nothing. Old women look out their windows. That's what old women do. But the next morning, walking Miles to the bus stop, I noticed her rose bushes had been trimmed in a strange pattern, almost like a sight line had been cut clean through the hedge, giving a direct view straight to our driveway and the spot where Miles always stood waiting. I brought it up to my sister Denise, who lived 20 minutes away in Rancho Cucamonga and had become my only real sounding board since Carla died. She told me I was spiraling, that grief makes you see conspiracies in gardening choices, and maybe she was right. I wanted her to be right. I didn't have room in my life for another problem. I was already drowning trying to keep Miles fed, clothed, and emotionally afloat while managing 3 ongoing construction projects that were all somehow behind schedule at the same time. But then came the binoculars. It was a Saturday afternoon, unseasonably warm, and Miles was in the front yard trying to get his skateboard to work on the cracked driveway. I was inside doing dishes, glancing out the kitchen window every so often, the way you do when your kid is technically old enough to be alone outside, but young enough that you still count the minutes. On my third glance, I saw Eleanor standing at her upstairs window again, this time in broad daylight, and this time there was no mistaking what she held: binoculars, pointed directly at my son. I don't remember deciding to move. One second I was at the sink. The next I was on my porch, my heart slamming against my ribs, watching her window until the curtain dropped and the shape disappeared. I didn't confront her that day. I told myself I needed to think it through, needed to not be the unhinged single dad who screams accusations at a widow because his grieving son said one strange sentence at a bus stop. But that night I didn't sleep. I lay in bed, running through every horror story I'd ever half remembered from the news. Every case of a quiet neighbor who turned out to be exactly the kind of person nobody suspected until it was too late. The next incident happened 4 days later, and this one I couldn't rationalize away no matter how hard I tried. Miles came home from school with a folded piece of paper in his backpack. Not homework, not a flyer, but a photograph. A printed photograph of him at the bus stop, taken from an angle that could only have come from Eleanor's upstairs window, time-stamped in the corner in small gray digital numbers. He said he found it tucked into the outside pocket of his backpack when he opened it at lunch. He didn't know how it got there. He was shaking when he showed me, his lower lip doing the thing it did right before he cried. And he said, "See, Dad? I told you. She's watching me. She put it in my bag. She's dangerous." I want to be honest about what went through me in that moment, because this is where I stopped being a rational adult and became something closer to an animal defending its only cub. I didn't think about calling the police first. I didn't think about due process or reasonable doubt, or any of the calm, rational frameworks I'd built my entire adult life around. I grabbed my jacket off the hook by the door, and I told Eli to stay inside and lock the deadbolt behind me, and I walked out into the cold with my heart doing something violent in my chest. The walk to Vivian Ashcroft's house was maybe 40 steps from my front porch to hers. 40 steps I had made 1,000 times before, without thinking, waving at her over the hedge, nodding when she watered her rose bushes in that wide straw hat she always wore, the one with the frayed brim that made her look like she'd stepped out of a photograph from another decade. 40 steps that had never once felt dangerous. But that night they felt like the longest walk of my life, because somewhere in my head a switch had flipped, and the woman who lived in that pale yellow house with the wind chimes on the porch had transformed into something else entirely. A threat, a shape I no longer recognized. I want to tell you what her house looked like from the outside that night, because it matters for what came after. The porch light was on, the same warm amber bulb she always kept burning, the kind of light that used to make me think of safety, of someone home, of a person who wasn't hiding anything. There was a ceramic pot by her front step with dead marigolds in it, stems gone brown and brittle from a cold snap 2 weeks earlier that she hadn't gotten around to clearing out. Her curtains were drawn, but there was a strip of light bleeding through the gap where the fabric didn't quite meet, and I remember staring at that thin gold line like it might tell me something. And then I saw the ambulance. It wasn't there when I first stepped off my porch. I know that because I would have seen the lights immediately, would have registered them the way you register a fire alarm, that sudden jolt of the body before the mind catches up. But by the time I reached the sidewalk that separated our two properties, it was already there, parked crooked in her driveway with the back doors flung open, red and white light strobing silently across the front of her house, across the dead marigolds, across my own frozen face. I stopped walking. I don't know for how long, long enough that a paramedic glanced up at me from where he crouched near the open doors, his expression unreadable in that professional, practiced way that people in emergency services learn to wear like armor. There were two of them, a man and a woman, both in Navy uniforms with reflective stripes down the sleeves. They were wheeling a gurney down her front walkway, and on it was Vivian Ashcroft, except she didn't look like the woman I had built into a monster over the last 2 hours. She looked small. She looked like someone's grandmother, which I suppose is exactly what she was, though I didn't know that yet. Her silver hair had come loose from whatever pin usually held it back, and had fanned out across the thin hospital pillow beneath her head. There was an oxygen mask over her mouth and nose, fogging faintly with each breath, and her eyes were closed, and her hands, folded on top of the blanket they'd wrapped her in, looked like something carved out of old wood, all knuckle and vein. I stood on that sidewalk, like a man who had walked into the wrong movie. Every version of the confrontation I'd rehearsed in my head on the way over. The accusations, the demand that she explain herself, the barely restrained fury I'd been carrying like a lit match. All of it evaporated in the space of about 4 seconds, replaced by something colder and more disorienting. Confusion, because you cannot scream at someone who is being loaded into an ambulance with an oxygen mask strapped to her face. There's no version of that confrontation that doesn't make you the villain of your own memory. A woman came jogging out of the house behind the gurney. She was younger, maybe mid-30s, wearing scrubs with cartoon sunflowers printed on them, her dark hair pulled back into a low ponytail that had started to come apart at the edges. She had a canvas tote bag slung over one shoulder, stuffed with what looked like folders, and a rolled-up blood pressure cuff, the kind of bag that belongs to someone who works in people's homes for a living. She caught my eye as she passed, and something in my face must have told her I wasn't just a curious neighbor, because she slowed down. "Are you family?" she asked. Her voice had the clipped, efficient warmth of someone who has delivered 1,000 small updates to 1,000 worried strangers. "No," I said. "I'm her neighbor." She nodded like that answered something, like neighbors showing up on sidewalks at night was a normal enough occurrence that it didn't require further explanation. "She's stable," she said, maybe reading the tightness in my jaw as fear rather than what it actually was, which was something closer to a held breath, waiting to find out if I'd been wrong about everything. "Her heart does this sometimes. We caught it early tonight. She'll be all right." "You're her nurse," I said. It wasn't really a question. "Home health aide," she corrected gently. "Rosa, I come by 3 times a week, sometimes more." She glanced back toward the ambulance, where the paramedics were now sliding the gurney into the back with the kind of practiced smoothness that told me this wasn't their first call to this address, maybe not even their first call this month. I should go with her, but if you're a neighbor, maybe you can let people know. She doesn't have a lot of family close by. That last sentence landed somewhere in my chest and just sat there, heavy, before I even understood why. "How long has she been sick?" I asked, and I heard my own voice come out strange, quieter than I meant it to, like the question belonged to someone else. Rosa hesitated. It was the hesitation of someone who has been trained in confidentiality, but is standing in a driveway at 9 at night, with red lights washing over her face, too tired to fully perform the caution her job requires. "Longer than she lets people believe," she said finally. "You should talk to her when she's back. She'd want you to know some things, I think. She talks about you, about your boy." And then she was gone, jogging the last few steps to climb into the back of the ambulance beside her patient, and the doors swung shut with that heavy, final sound. The ambulance pulled away down Larkspur Lane, its siren climbing from a low moan into that piercing wail that seemed to peel the night open, and I stood on the wet asphalt in my socks, because somewhere between running out my front door and reaching her porch, I had lost my shoes entirely. I didn't remember taking them off. I didn't remember much of the last 20 minutes, except the sound of my own heartbeat in my ears, and the paramedic's voice telling me things that didn't fit together in any order I could make sense of. "Longer than she lets people believe. Talk to her when she's back. She talks about you, about your boy." I stood there until the red and blue lights had shrunk to a smear against the tree line 2 streets over, until the neighborhood settled back into its ordinary hush, porch lights clicking off one by one as the show ended and people decided they'd seen enough for one Tuesday night. "Mrs. Russian, hello, and thank you for listening, and thank you for listening. My name is your new narrator. My name is your new narrator." Somewhere, a screen door banged shut, and then it was just me, standing in front of a house that had been dark and quiet and faintly threatening to my son for the better part of 2 years. Feeling like the ground under it had shifted without warning, I turned around and my boy was standing in our own doorway in his pajama bottoms, and the hoodie he refuses to take off even in August. Backlit by the hallway lamp, both hands pressed flat against the frame like he needed something solid to hold onto. He hadn't come any closer than that. He hadn't called out to me. He just watched the whole thing unfold from 20 feet away, the way kids do when the adults around them are moving too fast to explain anything. And something about the stillness of him standing there scared me more than the ambulance had. "Hey," I said, walking toward him, aware of the gravel biting into my bare feet and not caring. "Hey, bud, you okay?" He didn't answer right away. He looked past me, toward her house, toward the dark windows and the flower beds she kept obsessively neat, even though nobody in the neighborhood had ever seen her son or daughter or husband or a single visitor in all the time she'd lived there. "Is she gonna die?" he asked. His voice came out smaller than I expected from a 12-year-old who'd spent the last 2 years insisting, with total conviction, that the woman in that house was dangerous. "I don't know," I said, "because I didn't, and because I promised myself a long time ago, after his mother, that I would never lie to him about the things that actually mattered. The paramedics are taking good care of her. That's their whole job. She was on the ground," he said, "by the mailbox. I saw her go down before you even got out there." "You saw her fall?" He nodded, and something in his face tightened. Some effort to keep his composure that reminded me painfully of myself at funerals, at hospital waiting rooms, at every moment in the last several years when falling apart hadn't been an option. She was walking really slow already, like she'd been walking slow for a while. And then she just kind of folded, like her legs stopped working all at once. "Why were you watching her window, Eli?" He flinched at the question, and I realized too late how it sounded, like an accusation, when I'd only meant it as a real question, with a real answer I needed. He'd been telling me for 2 years to stay away from her, that something was wrong with her, that he didn't like the way she looked at our house sometimes, standing at her own window with the lights off, just looking. I'd chalked it up to a kid's overactive imagination working overtime on a lonely, private woman. Kids build monsters out of whatever's closest and strangest. I told him that more than once, gently. "The way you correct a kid who's afraid of the crack in the ceiling. I always watch," he said finally, quietly, like it cost him something to admit it. "I watch to make sure she's not doing anything." "Doing anything like what, bud?" He shook his head. "I don't know. Anything." I crouched down so we were eye level, the gravel digging into my knees now instead of my feet, and I asked him the question I probably should have asked 18 months ago instead of dismissing it. "Did something happen? Did she do something to you, or say something?" His eyes went glassy fast, the way they do right before he decides whether he's going to cry or shut down entirely, and he chose the second one, the way he almost always does, jaw setting, shoulders squaring, 12 years old, and already an expert at closing a door on himself. "It doesn't matter now," he said. "You're gonna go find out anyway. Everybody always finds out." I didn't understand what he meant by that, not then, standing on our lawn at 11 at night with an ambulance's afterimage still burning behind my eyes. I told myself it was just a kid's cryptic, half-formed way of processing fear, the kind of sentence that sounds ominous but means nothing once you trace it back to its source. I was wrong about that, the same way I'd been wrong about so much else concerning that house, but I wouldn't understand how wrong for another several days. I got him inside, got him a glass of water he didn't drink, sat on the edge of his bed until his breathing evened out into something like sleep, though I suspected he was faking it just enough to get me to leave the room. Then I went back downstairs and stood at our own front window, the one that faces hers, and looked at that dark house the same way he apparently had been looking at it for 2 years, and felt something twist low in my chest that I didn't have a name for yet. It wasn't grief exactly, because I hadn't let myself grieve her, not really, not with the things Caleb had said still sitting in my stomach like a stone I'd swallowed whole. It wasn't fear either, though there was some of that mixed in, cold and thin, the kind that makes the hair on your arms stand up for no reason you can point to. It was something closer to the feeling you get right before a storm breaks, when the air goes still and heavy, and every bird in the neighborhood stops singing at once, like they all know something you don't. I don't know how long I stood there. Long enough that the ice in the glass of water I never gave to Caleb had melted down to nothing in my hand. Long enough that my reflection in the window started to look like a stranger's, some tired man in his 40s with silver starting to show at his temples and a collar that had gone soft, from Asha, too many washes. I was about to turn away, about to go upstairs and check on Caleb one more time before trying to sleep myself, when I saw it. A light. Upstairs, in Marlene's house, second window from the left, the one I'd always assumed was a guest room because the curtains never changed. Always that same faded yellow, sun-bleached on one side from years of facing west. It flickered on for a second, maybe 2, a pale yellow glow behind the fabric, and then it was gone. I told myself it was a timer. People do that, don't they? When a house sits empty, Set a lamp on a timer so it looks lived in, so nobody gets ideas about breaking in and helping themselves to whatever's left behind. That's a normal thing. That's the kind of thing a lawyer or an estate manager sets up after somebody dies, especially somebody who lived alone the way Marlene had, especially somebody whose house was about to sit vacant for however long it takes lawyers to sort out wills and probate, and all the paperwork death leaves behind like a wake. But I stood there for another 5 minutes, and the light didn't come back on, and the house didn't creak with the particular settling sound that empty houses make, and something about the stillness of it bothered me more than the light itself had. I thought about the letter then. It was still in my coat, the one hanging on the hook by our front door, unopened, because when her lawyer had pressed it into my hands at the funeral home 3 days ago, my fingers had gone numb, and my ears had started ringing, and I hadn't been able to do anything except nod and say thank you, and walk out to my car like a man moving through water. I hadn't opened it since. I'd carried it around in my coat pocket the way you carry around a splinter. You're afraid to dig out, telling yourself you'll deal with it later, knowing every single day that later keeps getting pushed back because some part of you already suspects what's underneath the skin isn't going to be simple. Her lawyer's name was Adrian Voss, younger than I expected for somebody handling an estate like hers, maybe late 30s, with the kind of quiet, careful voice that made you lean in even when he wasn't saying anything urgent. He'd found me by the coffee table with the little foam cups and the sugar packets nobody uses at funerals, and he'd said, "Mr. R. Rumey, Hartley, I need a moment of your time." And something about the way he said it, low, almost apologetic, made the room around me go quiet in my own ears, even though it was still full of murmured condolences and shuffling feet. She left specific instructions, he'd told me, holding out an envelope, cream-colored, my name written across the front in handwriting I recognized instantly because I'd seen it on birthday cards she used to leave in our mailbox for Caleb every single year since he was 6 years old, neat and slanted and old-fashioned, the kind of handwriting nobody teaches anymore. She asked that you receive this personally, not through the mail, not through an estate packet, from me, in person, and only after the service. I'd asked him what it was, and he'd given me a look I still couldn't fully translate, something between sympathy and warning, and said, "I think it's best you read it when you're ready, Mr. Hartley. There's no rush, but I'd encourage you not to wait too long." Not too long. That's what he'd said, and here I was, 3 days later, standing at my own window in the dark, watching a dead woman's house like it might tell me something. The letter hadn't yet, because I still hadn't found the courage to slide my thumb under that cream-colored flap. The light didn't come back on. I watched for another 10 minutes, the water glass sweating in my hand, my sock feet cold against the hardwood, and eventually I told myself I'd imagined it, or that it really was a timer, some estate company's idea of deterring looters, and I went to bed. I didn't sleep. Not really. I lay there next to the empty side of the bed that had been empty for 2 years now, ever since Renee decided that raising Caleb and being married to a man who worked 60-hour weeks at a logistics company wasn't the life she'd signed up for, and I stared at the ceiling and ran through everything Caleb had said to me that afternoon, again and again, like a song stuck on a scratch. She was always watching us, Dad. She had a book. She wrote things down. I hadn't asked him what kind of things. I'd been too busy trying to calm him down, too busy being the dad who tells his son that dead neighbors can't hurt anybody anymore, that whatever strange habits Marlene Kessler had were just the habits of a lonely old woman who filled her days by paying too much attention to the people around her, because she didn't have much else to fill them with. I'd said all the reasonable things a father says, and lying there in the dark, I realized I hadn't actually believed a single one of them, not even while I was saying them out loud. Around 2 in the morning, I gave up on sleep entirely and went back downstairs, this time with my phone in hand, and I did something I probably should have done 3 days earlier. I searched her name, Marlene Kessler. There wasn't much. A handful of local news mentions going back almost 15 years, most of them related to a nonprofit she'd apparently run out of her home for a while, something involving legal aid for women, though the articles were vague about specifics and none of them were more recent than 2013. There was an obituary, the standard kind, brief, generic, the kind written by a funeral home template rather than someone who actually knew her. Survived by no immediate family. Predeceased by her husband, Walter Kessler, in 2009. No children listed. A woman who apparently had built an entire life next door to us for over a decade, and the internet had almost nothing to say about her beyond the fact that she had once existed and then stopped. I typed her name alongside the word lawyer, and Adrian Voss's firm came up. A small practice 2 towns over. 3 attorneys total according to the website. Nothing flashy, no billboard-worthy names. I stared at his photo on the site for a long moment, that same careful expression from the funeral home staring back at me from a professional headshot. And I thought about calling the number listed under his name right then, at 2 in the morning, just to hear another human voice confirm that any of this was real. I didn't call. Instead, I went and got my coat off the hook, and I finally took the envelope out, and I sat down at the kitchen table with it in front of me, like it was something that might go off if I moved too fast. I got as far as running my thumb along the seal. That's when I heard it. Not from inside my house. From outside, from the direction of her yard, a sound sharp enough to cut straight through the quiet of 2 in the morning. The specific, unmistakable creak of her side gate swinging open, the one that led from her driveway back toward the fence line between our properties. I know that sound, because I've heard it 100 times over the years, Marlene pushing through it with an armful of gardening tools, or hauling her trash cans out on Thursday mornings, always that same rusty complaint from the hens she never bothered to oil. I sat very still, the envelope still sealed in front of me, and listened. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, not the frantic scrambling of a raccoon or a stray cat, but the even, careful ghoul.